Do you know that for the first 50 years of its history, the state of Maryland did not permit Jews to hold public office? Jews could not serve in the state legislature, could not be officials in the state government, could not be officers in the state militia, could not be judges in the state courts, could not be lawyers, and could not even serve on juries in Maryland. It took Jews and their Christian allies decades, till 1826, to pass legislation known as the Jew Bill, to change this situation. Here's the story. After the 13 American colonies declared their independence from Great Britain in July 1776, the 13 new states had to set up their own new state governments. In the fall of 1776, delegates from across Maryland gathered in Annapolis for a constitutional convention. The resulting Maryland Constitution of 1776 had some provisions that may seem surprising today. Article 35 of the Declaration of Rights that began the Constitution required that people holding public office make, quote, a declaration of belief in the Christian religion, close quote. The Constitution's Declaration of Rights first makes a broad statement of religious equality, but then seems to narrow it to Christians, quote, as it is the duty of every man to worship God in such manner as he thinks most acceptable to him. All persons professing the Christian religion are equally entitled to protection in their religious liberty, close quote. The United States Constitution of 1787 expressly contradicted this Maryland requirement of Christian faith for office holders. Article 6 of the United States Constitution prohibited religious tests for public office. The Bill of Rights of 1791 reinforced this federal prohibition by barring government establishment of religion. The delegates who adopted the religious test in the Maryland Constitution of 1776 probably thought that they were making progress by safeguarding the rights of all Christians. The colony of Maryland had a long history of religious intolerance. Although the colony was founded in 1632 by Silas Calvert as a refuge for Catholics who were being persecuted in England, the colony was mostly settled by Protestants who discriminated against the Catholic minority. In 1716, for example, Catholics lost the right to vote in Maryland. Discrimination against Maryland Jews was much worse. Jews had no civil rights. The Maryland Toleration Act of 1649, also known as the Act Concerning Religion, mandated religious tolerance, but only among Christians who believed in the Trinity, that God is composed of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Anyone who denied this belief was to be put to death and have all his property taken away. Ooh. In 1723, the law was moderated so that offenders could be punished by having a hole bored into their tongues or having their foreheads branded. With such so-called toleration laws on the books, it is likely that Jews avoided moving to Maryland, and those who lived in Maryland kept a very low profile. It is believed that no more than a handful of Jews had settled in Baltimore, Maryland's largest city, by 1780. Therefore, it is quite possible that those who voted in favor of the Constitution of Maryland in 1776 did not know any Jews, and perhaps did not know that Maryland had any Jews living there. Catholics praised the religious test provision because it assured them of political rights in the new state. The Maryland Constitution was not alone in requiring a Christian religion for office holders. Most of the other original states had similar constitutional restrictions. Although by 1791, the Maryland Constitution was in conflict with both the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Maryland Assembly took no action to change the Maryland Constitution. The Jews of Maryland would have to take the initiative. By 1797, there was a small community of Jews living in Baltimore. Perhaps the most prominent of these was Solomon Edding, who had fought in the Revolution and had been active in public affairs in Pennsylvania before moving to Baltimore. Eddings served as a director of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which was the first railroad company in America. In 1797, Edding and other Jewish leaders submitted a petition to the Maryland Assembly, saying that Jews, quote, are deprived of invaluable rights of citizenship, closed quote, because of the religious test for public office and want to be, quote, placed on the same footing as other good citizens, closed quote. That was the beginning of a 30-year struggle to remove the restriction on non-Christians holding public office in Maryland. This struggle took place during the 1790s and the first 2 decades of the 1800s, and there was intensifying debate in Maryland between two political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans generally represented Baltimore and other urban areas, as well as the frontier settlements in the state. The Federalists represented the rural and conservative areas. Much of the debate centered around the political power of Baltimore and whether its growing population should be reflected in state assembly representation. Because the small Jewish population in the state was located mostly in Baltimore, the fate of Jewish political rights was intertwined with the success of the Democratic and Republicans. Federalists controlled one or both houses of the Maryland Assembly until 1823. Although a committee of the Assembly found the Jews' 1797 petition reasonable, the Assembly took no action. In 1800, voting rights were extended to all free white male citizens over the age of 21 who had resided in Maryland for at least 1 year, eliminating the previous property ownership requirement. Thus, by the time that Eddings submitted a second petition to the Assembly in 1802, all white males could vote. Legislation to permit Jews to hold public office was introduced and voted on for the first time in 1802. The legislation did not amend the Constitution, but granted the Jews the same rights as enjoyed by Christians under the Constitution. It was defeated 38-17 in the Maryland House of Delegates. The same legislation, widely known as the Jew Bill, was reintroduced in 1804 and once again defeated 39-24. Neither time did the legislation reach the Maryland Senate. Nearly 15 years would go by before there was another attempt to revise the religious test. During this period, a number of important developments expanded political rights in Maryland and increased the visibility of the Jewish community there. In 1809, owning property was eliminated as a prerequisite for holding office in Maryland. All white Christian males were now qualified to hold public office. Changes in the way people viewed the Jewish population also took place. First, the Jewish population of Maryland continued to increase and grow in prominence. It is believed that about 100 Jews lived in Baltimore by 1818, including Jacob Cohen, who established a bank that had a national reputation. Second, a number of Jews served in defense of Fort McHenry in the War of 1812, burnishing the reputation of Jews as good citizens and patriots. Third, several examples of the impact of the Constitution's religious test came to public attention. A. Simon Levy was selected as one of the 2 Marylanders to enter the first class at West Point. He could not have been commissioned an officer in the state militia. B. Samuel Edding, Solomon Edding's son, who was known as a brilliant student, was unable to pursue his desired career as a lawyer because of the Constitution's religious test. C. Reuben Edding, Solomon Edding's brother, was appointed to a federal position by President Jefferson, but he could not have served in a state position of much lower rank because of the state constitution. Finally, the Jews gained a champion in the legislature. The delegate Thomas Kennedy, elected to the House in 1817, dedicated himself to eliminating the religious test for public office in Maryland. Perhaps at Kennedy's instigation in 1818, the House of Delegates appointed a committee, composed of Kennedy and two other legislators, to determine whether the religious test for public office should be changed. The committee submitted a unanimous report that explained why Jews should be granted equal rights. The Jew Bill was introduced in 1818 and again in 1819, but was twice defeated in the House. First by a vote of 50 to 24, and then by a vote of 47 to 20. It was not taken up in the Senate. In the Maryland Assembly's 1822 session, another three-member committee, including Kennedy, again unanimously recommended that the religious test for public office be changed. This time, however, the committee recommended a universal bill that would, quote, extend to all citizens of Maryland the same civil and religious rights and privileges that are enjoyed under the Constitution of the United States, close quote. This universal version passed the House by a vote of 40 to 33, then the Senate by a vote of 8 to 7 in 1822. Victory was not yet complete, however, because legislation that overrode a constitutional provision needed to pass in two successive legislative sessions. Consequently, the bill needed to be adopted again in the 1823 legislative session in order to take effect. After the bill to remove the religious test for office was passed, for the first time in 1822, it became a major issue in the state elections of 1823. 16 of the 40 delegates who voted for the bill were defeated for re-election. Kennedy himself lost his seat to an opponent running on a so-called Christian slate. In the face of these election losses, Jacob Cohen and other representatives of the Jews in Maryland wrote to the Assembly urging legislators to pass the bill a second time, since the Jews were only asking for rights that everyone else had. But this argument failed. Although the Senate passed the measure a second time by a vote of 8 to 6, the House, now populated by many delegates elected precisely because of their opposition to the Jew Bill, defeated it by a vote of 44 to 28. Kennedy regained his seat 2 years later and resumed his advocacy of the Jew Bill. He concluded that the universal version would not pass, so he reverted to the version specifically limited to Jews. The Jewish community had urged the same strategy. The records of speeches by the all-Christian legislators advocating for the Jew Bill in those years illuminate the arguments that were made on its behalf. Political and economic grounds all came into play. The political arguments for the bill invoked the founding documents of the United States. Some supporters quoted the Declaration of Independence and its principle that all men are created equal. One advocate, Delegate Henry Brackenridge, argued that the U.S. Constitution granted freedom of religion and that removing the Maryland provision, therefore, did not grant Jews rights that they did not already have under federal constitutional law. He also noted that Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution prohibited religious tests for offices. George Washington's cordial relations with the Jewish community were also cited. Other advocates appealed to religious values. They cited the teachings of Christianity, including the Golden Rule. They claimed that Jesus would have supported the political rights of Jews, who were historically downtrodden and oppressed. Economic arguments seemed increasingly persuasive to legislators. Proponents of the Jew Bill argued that the restrictions on Jewish political rights discouraged wealthy Jews from choosing to live in Maryland. Delegate J.W.D. Worthington noted in an 1824 speech that Solomon Edding, responding to the delegates' questions, estimated that there were 150 Jews in Maryland with a total wealth up to $500,000. Detractors turned the argument about Jewish economic power around by arguing that if the Jew Bill were enacted, Jews would migrate to Maryland in unwanted numbers, and some opponents appealed to prejudice and fear. At one point, a propaganda pamphlet was placed on the desk of every legislator, asserting that the bill was advocated principally by, quote, pagan idolaters and heathens, close quote. Controversy over the Jew bill in Maryland caught the attention of the press across the country. The widely read Niles Weekly Register, published in Baltimore, was an outspoken supporter of the Jew bill. Those opposing the bill were criticized in the newspapers in Charleston, South Carolina, Natchez, Mississippi, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and New York. It was noted that Maryland was the last state to retain a religious restriction on public office holding. On the last day of the 1824 session, after the Senate had enacted the Jew bill, the House barely passed it by a vote of 26 to 25. A large number of the 80 delegates may have left Annapolis by that day to avoid voting on the legislation. The measure finally passed for the second time in the House of January 1826 by a vote of 45 to 32 after being adopted by the Senate almost unanimously. Notably, the legislation permitted Jews to hold public office so long as they declared a belief in, quote, a future state of rewards and punishments, close quote. It stated, quote, every citizen of this state professing the Jewish religion appointed to any office of public trust shall make and subscribe a declaration of his belief in a future state of rewards and punishments, instead of the declaration now required, close quote. Apparently, only Jews believing in heaven and hell were eligible to hold public office in Maryland. Be that as it may, Jacob Cohen and Solomon Edding were soon elected to the Baltimore City Council, the first Jews elected to public office in the history of Maryland. It took another 4 decades before the Maryland Constitution itself was overhauled and the Christian religious restrictions removed. The Constitution, adopted in 1867, no longer referred to public office holders having a belief in the Christian religion, but it required a belief in God. That requirement remains in the Maryland Constitution today.
It took many more years for African Americans and women to gain full political equality in Maryland. Full voting rights for African Americans in Maryland were not achieved until 1870, with the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Maryland women did not win the right to vote until 1920, with the 19th Amendment. The first woman was not elected to the Maryland House of Delegates until 1921, and the first African Americans were not elected to the House until 1954. Despite the incompleteness of the political equality achieved by the Jew Bill of 1826, the struggle that culminated in that enactment showed that interfaith alliances and perseverance could overcome religious intolerance and opposition to the expansion of political rights. Jews would find that true time and again, in Maryland and in America, in the years to come.